Okay, I think we're going to get started. People straggle in as they are getting out of their morning meetings and finding the location. And for those of you in the back, feel free to slide on up. I promise I don't bite. That costs extra. But welcome. Thank you all so much for taking the time today to come out and join me for a topic that I think is one of the things we wish we didn't have to discuss, but seems to present itself to us all too frequently: the issue of conflict and how to work with it. Ideally, how to avoid it, which is what we all really want to do, but not to avoid the issue that's underlying the conflict. That's the challenge. Where is that balance between the two? I mean, how many people know someone who they would classify as seriously conflict averse? Just like run away, avoid, deny at all costs. How many of that for you is that person is you? Okay, good, honest people. I appreciate that. Now, how many people know someone on the other end of the spectrum where conflict just seems to follow them everywhere? It's almost impossible to get in a conversation with them that doesn't end up in some form of debate, argument, who knows what. Okay. And for how many of you, that's you? Okay, a couple of good, honest people. I appreciate that. We will have good conversation today. So where it gets interesting, of course, is when we're in a situation where the first group of hand raisers is in conversation with the second group of hand raisers, and you end up playing this cat and mouse game, right? No, I need to fight with you on this. No, you can't. I will not let you fight with me on that. So how do we find a way to make sure that no matter what kind of orientation people have on the subject of conflict, we're able to have a productive and constructive conversation rather than a destructive conversation, which is at the heart of everybody's fear? So moving from there, there's a couple of quick objectives today. And by the way, I should preface, I tell a lot of people, I'm a Jersey Italian by birth, which means that I'm genetically able to speak at about twice the speed of light when I get really going on something. So if I dust you at some point, feel free to just flag me down, ask me to back up, repeat something, not a problem. And I do want this to be really interactive, so do freely ask questions, just interrupt me, raise your hand if you're more comfortable with it, but no need to wait until the end. Okay, so number one, I want to be able to distinguish different orientations, not just to conflict, but to the perception of conflict, because that's not a standard objective construct. The second is to be able to identify how to make sure that everyone is speaking and listening from the heart. How do you know that someone's going to tell you the truth? How do you know that someone's going to hear what you're saying openly without having that filter? How can we try to break down those barriers? And then the third is to look at three key strategies to make sure that you're keeping the conversation on track and avoiding the drama. Because that's where you start to feel that slippery slope, right? The emotions start to rise and the drama begins. And that's when you sort of know you need to redirect fast, otherwise it's just going to get ugly. Go downhill really quickly. So we want to make sure that we stay on track, stay focused, and we achieve a mutually agreeable outcome for everybody. It's not to say everybody's going to get 100% of what they want, but that the resolution comes to a point where we are in acceptance of this and we're still okay. So what is conflict? Now, at the base, a conflict is just an incompatibility. At some point, we have scheduling conflicts. Right? You want to attend the seminar today, but you also have a meeting or baseball tickets. That was a reason I just heard of somebody going, I really wanted to be here today, but you got free Phillies tickets. Okay, I don't blame you. In 65-degree sunny weather, I'd go too. So a conflict is simply an incompatibility. And that's where I think everybody needs to start with their focus, recognizing that, okay, there's a potential conflict here, but all that means is that something doesn't match, that something's not compatible. It doesn't necessarily mean drama and major strife to happen. Of course, when you escalate things further, then we end up in the stage of battle. And this is what everybody is afraid that conflict is going to turn into. So it's important to remember that it doesn't have to go that direction. So we want to find some approaches today to make sure that they don't need to. Okay, so looking at the orientation of conflict, you have to start by identifying people's priorities. And in this priority, you're going to try to balance two things that fall along a pretty wide continuum. On the one hand, People need to protect relationships. This is where diplomacy comes in. People who tend to avoid conflict very strongly, their primary priority is to not hurt someone's feelings, not be rude, not upset someone else, not get in trouble, to make sure that we are okay, first and foremost. On the other hand, there's the need to be clear, unambiguous, to make sure that the message is understood. But often that comes at a price. How much are you willing to be direct, to be blunt, to be clear, to ensure that somebody understands exactly what needs to be done, because you can't afford the risk of misunderstanding, especially when there's a lot of money or other things that are involved at stake? And how much are you willing to sacrifice one or the other? This is the challenge. When you have someone whose primary internal compass is gravitating towards must be clear at all costs, thick skin is necessary, being direct is necessary, working with someone who is on the other end of the spectrum, where they first and foremost need to make sure that we're being nice, that there's nothing uncomfortable about this, and they're willing to hedge and imply and indirectly hint about certain things because they don't necessarily want to give bad news, or they don't want to say something that will upset you, or they don't want it to escalate into the other kind of conflict. This is where the challenge begins, starting with the underlying priorities. I worked with a manager and an employee in one client company, and it was interesting because the manager was someone, she was a woman, I would say mid-40s or so, from the Deep South, and to her own explanation, she was raised in a culture where good manners and maintaining relationships and politeness and respect were paramount at all costs. Now, her employee was an African-American woman from West Philadelphia who had raised herself up by her bootstraps, overcome more than I could ever have imagined. She had her act together, but it wasn't about fighting. It was, we got to get stuff done. I'm here to get stuff done. If I need to get stuff done, you tell me what needs to get done and I'll do it. And if you don't like the way it's done, you tell me that you don't like the way it's done and I'll redo it. But what's the problem? Very clear, very strong, very direct, very Philly, way to represent. But now the problem, of course, was that when she would turn in something to her manager, for example, that was not up to par, the manager hesitated about how to present it without sounding like she was complaining or like she was criticizing, or in a way, and I don't know whether there were some cultural issues as far as fear of being perceived as racist, or fear of the age difference, or fear of many other things, where people tend to hide a little bit too much. And so instead, she would just end up redoing the woman's work because she didn't want to tell her. So it was, of course, then it becomes insulting, because why didn't you just tell me to do it? And it was interesting to put them on, when I had them in the room together, I drew this line, and I asked them each to draw it on their own papers, and then to put an X somewhere along the line to see how they would rate themselves. What was most important to them? How far along the continuum were they? And the manager drew herself about here. And the employee drew herself about here. So when they were able to put their arrows together and realize that they were practically mirror images, like mirror opposite images of each other, it helps to understand where the other person is coming from. So what was important was for the manager to recognize that it's okay, her employee's tolerance for directness before feeling the anxiety of criticism or critique was so much further than she had originally anticipated, that she had to actually remind herself to start using language that was in her gut, in her heart, harsher. Wasn't harsh by objective standards, but it was more direct, and thereby it was harsher. And the employee at the same time needed to understand, okay, I'm gonna have to go out of my way to tell the boss, please tell me what wasn't working. I'm giving you what you've requested from me. If something's not right, I need you to tell me what it was so I can fix it. And it's okay to do it. Now, should you have to tell your boss this? That's a different question that we're not going to discuss here today. But this was something that she realized for herself as within her own world of leadership, she was going to have to manage up, so to speak, leading her boss to be able to do it. Now, it was interesting to watch the dynamic also because the one body language was this, and the other body language was this. I honestly wanted to watch I could imagine the manager wanting to crawl under the table. She was so uncomfortable with this whole conversation, really like stammering her way through, trying to explain things to me, and it was unbelievably uncomfortable to watch. And when I asked the employee, what do you notice in her body language? She just said, "Oh no." So when you're dealing with someone who also doesn't necessarily have the lens, that kind of interpersonal intuition, or there's different kinds of intelligences of sorts, but that ability to recognize, to read body language, that empathy level, then that's different also. Because in order to be able to have these dialogues, we have to be able to start to recognize objectively and then subjectively understand the other person's gravitation on this level. And this is where it begins. So the question then is, where do you fit? If you had to rank yourself, if you had to put your X on this line, how many people would put it more over on this side? A couple hands going up. How many feel like you're pretty balanced in the middle? Like you understand there's a need for both, but your skin's pretty thick, but not Teflon, and okay? And how many people would gravitate over this way? Shivani, really? So this is part of the understanding, figuring out where you are, and then starting to look at other people through that comparative lens. Where do you fall compared to them? And then when we take that in the context of conflict, we can sort of, that's interesting, think about, wake up. Okay, anybody know where? It did, okay. There we go. So the question, back up. On the continuum of conflict, on the one end, in conversation, there's just peace. We agree, everything's good. We all like to be here. This is home base for everybody. But then you go into, we have a discussion, and then maybe there's a disagreement, and ultimately that turns into a debate where it's still maybe objective. And then emotion starts to get into it a little more, and maybe we slide more into the argument and the need to be right or to prove someone else wrong. And that can lead into fighting and battle and ultimately war, which naturally we'd like to avoid at all costs. But from here, the key question becomes, where is your anxiety threshold? Because as you proceed along that continuum, you start to feel that little bubbling sensation in the pit of your stomach, that burning in the chest. At what point along that line do you start to feel it? Because when you do finally start to feel it kick in, that's what I want to call your threshold. Now, there's a point where you can feel it, okay, you're not enjoying this at this point, but it's still okay. We're having an important discussion, and I don't mind the critical feedback, et cetera. I'm enjoying it, but it's fine. Versus when you get to the point where you're going, I don't want to have this conversation anymore. And we all hit that point. It's just a matter of when. So from there, at what point does it become intolerable? And that's where we look at the first orientation, which is the grayscale conflict orientation. So if you think about the continuum as going from white to black, whichever direction you want to look at it, the gray shading is different for each person, depending on where you fit. Now, if you notice, the numbers don't line up exactly with the words. There's 8 categories, and mind you, these are my subjective assessments of categories. But there's 8 of those, and there's 9 numbers. So if you sort of think about where you land, it's going to tell you, so for example, that for me, I'm about a 5. I'm good with debate. I like a good debate. It's interesting, as long as it's not getting personal. We can get heated about it. It's fine. And we'll go out, have a glass of wine afterwards, it's all good. Or maybe have a glass of wine during, makes it even better. But once you start getting into the argument, and then we're unhappy with each other because of something, then it's uncomfortable. Now it's influencing the relationship. That's where I sort of draw my line. That's where my threshold is That's where the anxiety level goes from being tolerable. I mean, of course, there's a little adrenaline kicking in during the debate, but that's part of what makes it fun for me. But it's when it slides past that point that the anxiety becomes intolerable. That's where I want it to end. That's where I need to get out of that conversation, change the subject, leave, do whatever it is. Now, when you look at some other people, for example, my husband, and I'm allowed to talk about him because he's standing back there. So he will quickly correct me if I do not set the record straight from the beginning. My husband's got a slightly stronger tolerance for this kind of discussion, for this kind of anxiety level. If you notice, the white stretches a lot further before it starts getting dark. For him, growing up, a good yelling match in the house was perfectly normal. That was not. He's actually waving now that I should have moved this over further. We'll be meeting with some family later on, and I get a kick out of watching him and his uncle, who is quite opinionated, loves to debate politics, and one of my husband's favorite pastimes is to poke the bear. Sit down, drop a little grenade of a conversation in a way that he knows his uncle will not agree with, and just watch it ignite. And they'll sit there for hours going back and forth. It'll get louder and louder. And for many people, they'd be watching going, oh my God, make it stop. I don't want to be in the same room. I can't imagine being part of that conversation. This is not how family should be. 2 hours later, they're going to go get a sandwich. Hug. It was all part of the fun. So the anxiety is completely tolerable up to a very high point where most people by here would be ready to walk away from this conversation. No, completely normal. It's not until you get further along that then it becomes intolerable. So needless to say, even when he and I are having our conversations and we disagree about something, we have to watch how intense it gets because I need it to stop before the intensity escalates to a point where he needs it to stop. So we're working on making sure that we always stay to the left of where we would both have a mutually understood level of tolerance. Now, I also worked with a director in a different company who had a much, much, much more extreme orientation to conflict. And that's part of why she was working with me. Actually, that was all of why she was working with me. Because to her, she had come up through, let's say, a family and a culture where yelling was the norm, bad language was the norm, insulting was the norm, calling someone out in front of everybody else and saying, what the hell is up with that, is the norm. Passive aggression in the form of things like, what, are you trying to get me fired? Is that why you're giving me this garbage? Was the norm. Now, she didn't necessarily like it when people spoke to her that way, but she accepted it as normal because to her, the need to be clear was much more important than the need to be nice. And diplomacy was synonymous with walking on eggshells and pussyfooting around the issue. She just felt like people needed to man up, grow up, toughen up, whatever up, and deal with it. If you made a mistake, own it, fix it. I shouldn't be happy with you because you made it. I'll be happy with you when you fix it. That's how life works. So to her, honestly, I don't know where her intolerable level of anxiety was. There was always the adrenaline, there was always the anxiety, there was always the stress involved, but it was a status quo, it was a norm for her. So teaching her how to recognize where it wasn't necessary to do that, where you could still be clear and diplomatic at the same time, to better ends, and where it could actually be pleasant to have conversations with colleagues or employees where we needed to give corrections or work on something where we may not agree, even with the people where you just know, when I have a conversation with that guy, we're gonna disagree and we're gonna end up arguing about something. Once she started to understand this and recognize how to adjust the language accordingly so that she could be direct without being hurtful in the language and still being diplomatic enough so that the other person could save face in the process, she came back the next week and said, I can't believe I actually had a good conversation with him. First time in 2 years we had a really good conversation. Look at that, that's all it took. And granted, it wasn't a lunchtime conversation, it was a work conversation, but that was the whole point. It doesn't have to be antagonistic. And she kept saying, but it was, how do I keep it clear when I don't have time to be nice and time to pussyfoot and time to do this and time to do that. I said, well, let me ask you this. If you don't have time to do it right, when will you have time to do it over? And she went, oh. I think that was actually her face. But recognizing that, investing the time to choose your words carefully, to think about the delivery, to build up to certain things, invest that time once so you don't have to reinvest it 27 other times around. Now on the flip side, the vice president or the VP and actually a manager that I worked with, who I'd referred to earlier, was far more down this side. The need to stay in peace, in agreement. That's where we're happy place. That's where we're good. We can talk as long as we're just having a conversation. But as soon as it starts getting uncomfortable, as soon as it starts getting a little bit gray, if you notice how much black there is before it starts to lighten up on that gray scale, the perception for them is much, much more sensitive. You only have a little bit of flexibility before it's suddenly intolerable, and the need to run away kicks in, or to avoid so as not to start. So when people start getting further and further to this extreme, it's almost no longer a grayscale orientation to conflict. It's what I would refer to as a black and white orientation. People see that there's peace and there's war, and there really isn't a lot of middle ground. Either I'm comfortable or I'm uncomfortable. We're at a good place or we're not in a good place. And that's really important to recognize. If you either are someone or if you're working with someone who tends to have a very sensitive trigger to that kind of adrenaline, who tends to have more of a black and white orientation to conflict, you need to address them in a different way. Not in a way that's condescending, not in a way that is otherwise embarrassing, but to recognize that for them to hear you, there needs to be a different approach. So what we want to look at from here is the key to approaching those difficult conversations. First, we have to start by thinking about the other person's respective tolerance for anxiety. Where is their threshold on that sliding scale relative to your own? So it's a good idea to sort of think about how far along, what number are you? I'd be a 5, my husband would be a 7. If you're a 4, if you're a 6, a 2, understand that other people have very different orientations from you to begin with. Then from there, when you're on that sliding scale, if you know that you're here and someone else is here, you need to start at the farthest point left where you both are in agreement. So if to the degree where we're just having a disagreement, that level of intensity is all that you know that person can handle, and that's also in your safe zone, then that's where you need to bring it down to. The pitfall, what we tend to do wrong, is that we listen to win. When we're in a conversation with someone, our whole focus in listening, our goal in listening, tends to be to figure out when you can interrupt and give your own point, right? You're listening, and the first 2 words that want to come out of your mouth are, yeah, but, right? You're not in agreement, and your goal is to make the other person understand why you're right and they're wrong. Agreed? Typically. So both people end up feeling like you're not listening to me. And you can both yell that as loud as you want, but it doesn't make it easier. And when you have that kind of dynamic going on, there's only 2 possible outcomes. The first is that you're both frustrated in the end and there's no solution, or no resolution at least. And the other option being that there's technically a winner and a loser. Maybe there's a power differential and somebody's going to force the other one to accept it and just say, deal with it. That's too bad. So you've got a winner and a loser. But in the end, really, everybody loses, because there's going to be repercussions for this in future discussions. And when you think about it, for those who like to win, who need to be right all the time, if that is your prime focus, consciously or subconsciously, think about this. If you know that in any disagreement you have to be right and prove the other person wrong, then that means anytime you are in a conversation like that with someone else, the only way for that person to walk away is to accept that they are wrong and be the loser. So you have to think about, is that the kind of dynamic I want? Is that going to invite people in to feel like they can have difficult conversations with me if the only way they'll be able to leave the conversation is knowing that they've lost? And this is hard to sort of swallow, but at the same time, we all like to be right. So how do we find that balance? What's the alternative? The alternative is listening to understand. Now, that seems really simple, but I find that things that are simple are not necessarily easy. So in listening to understand, first, we need to put aside all of your assumptions, right? We walk into most of these conversations thinking, well, I know what he's going to say. He says it all the time. Same old, same old. I don't need to hear any more. I already know. So I just need to tell him why he's wrong. Instead, accept the fact that if they're still fighting on something, you probably are missing something important. So what is it about their priorities, their values, their concerns? Is there a competing priority, a pressure coming from somewhere else that's forcing them to really just dig their heels in on this one? What is the nature of their resistance? Accept the fact that there is information you do not have. And it's your job in this conversation, in listening to understand, to figure out what that is. Then, in order to do that, before you start in on why you wanted to talk and what you want them to understand, invite them to talk first. Showing that you're willing to listen is disarming. Knowing that they will actually get a chance to talk and the conversation that you invited them into wasn't really just coming in to sit and listen to you harangue for 20 minutes, that helps people to be open to whatever you may say later. But they know that they're going to get to say what they need to say. So from here, strategy number 1 in listening to understand, take notes. Go old school on it. Be crazy. Take out pencil and paper. If you need to, fine, pull out the phone and take notes with 2 thumbs. Whatever makes you happy. But take notes as you're listening. And there's a couple reasons why. First, it helps you remember what they said so you can refer back to it later with greater accuracy. Second, it gives you a chance to jot down points. You don't have to transcribe. Don't write down everything that they say. But when there's something that sticks out to you, it gives you a chance to make a note. And then as you're writing down things that you want to address, you can hold off and ask those questions later. And this is good because it keeps you from interrupting. Nobody likes to be interrupted. But as the person's talking, you're probably going to hear a couple of things that you want to address. Maybe misperceptions you want to correct, or maybe additional information you want to give them, or could be anything. But let them finish. Because what that will also do is it gives you a chance to really organize your thoughts and digest their whole message. When people talk, especially under emotional situations, they're not always logical and organized. It's sort of stream of consciousness venting. Everything that's been stored up and bottled up is now going to come out, and it may or may not be something of a rabbit trail running all over the place, trying to figure out where they're really going with it. So hold off on asking those questions or contradicting or whatever else, because they may actually get to that later on, and that would take it off the table. The issue has resolved itself. What's most important is that as you're taking those notes, you are not doing it so that you can just counterpoint everything that they have said. And this was something that I worked on with a different manager where she was notoriously detail-oriented. So when she started originally, she would say to me, well, I took notes, but then what should have been a 20-minute conversation turned into a 2.5-hour conversation because she would need to go line item by line item litigiously to tell the other person where they were wrong on everything that they said. Needless to say, kind of defeats the purpose of listening to understand. That's just listening to prove all the places where you're wrong and I'm right. Not much of an invitation there. So the idea is that you want to do your best to organize your thoughts, prioritize, and figure out on the big picture, what are the most important points we need to discuss today? And how do these 7 or 8 different issues that you brought up all relate to that topic? Maybe some you're just going to have to let go. And that's hard for some people, to just let go. But if you need your priorities to be met, you have a choice to make. You can either address everything superficially and without resolution, or you can pick a couple of things and get complete. And usually if you can resolve the big issues, the little ones either won't matter anymore or will come into play later with a lot more ease. Strategy number 2, once you've taken those notes, you've done your silent listening, as difficult as that is, you're going to do a nice, easy little segue and start by thanking the person for sharing all of it. Because what's important is that they feel safe. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but in inviting them to this conversation, it's most important that you know that you will both feel safe to express your true thoughts, ideally respectfully to each other, but especially when there's a power differential. If the person you want to talk to is under you in the org chart, below you, then there's some challenge there. There's a fear of repercussion if they're honest. So we need to make sure that everyone feels safe. So you want to thank them and then explain that what you're going to do in a moment, now that they've had a chance to say their piece, you're going to do some confirmation checks. And you'll let them know, I'm just going to feed back to you what it is that I heard you say, and I just want you to tell me if I've misunderstood anything. I want to make sure that I understand everything. Is that okay? Ask permission to do this. Who'd say no? But at least at that point, they understand your motivation for what you're about to do. And at that point, assuming they say, sure, go ahead, because you're not launching right into, oh, okay, you're done talking, good, my turn. Now you listen. No, you're done. I want to make sure I understood. Please correct my understanding as necessary. So you're going to paraphrase what they've said, use reporting language. And what I mean by reporting language is things like, so you stated that you felt like this. Is that correct? Not interpretation. So it seems like you wanted to do this because of, no, you said this because this. I'm only feeding back to you exactly what you said, even if I think it's the dumbest thing I've heard all day. I'm going to very objectively and calmly say, your complaint is this, your concern is that, your request is this. Do I understand correctly? Because in the end, what people just want to know is that they've been heard. And you can only do that if you make sure that you are not commenting yet. It's still not your turn. You're talking, but you're still in listening mode. This is part of your check. From here, now there may be some back and forth where the person said, no, that's not what I said. Or they may say, well, yes, I guess I said that, but what I meant was, good. Give them a chance to realize maybe they weren't the clearest. They were speaking emotionally and not accurately when they blurted out what it was. So it gives them a chance to adjust their story as well. Then you can't hold that against them, what they said originally. Stick with what they are stating. Then strategy number 3 is to help them listen to understand in return, so that the conversation goes in both directions. Now it's your turn to share your side of the story. So as you do that segue, you can do it with something simple like, all right, so you feel like that I understand what it is that your concern was. Is that correct? They say yes. All right. Let me share with you some additional information, meaning now it's my turn to give information to you. But what's important for them is to, as you're sharing this with them, you can point out to them what would be referred to as on a kind of a metacognitive level, how you would like them to listen to you. So if they didn't notice what you were doing for them, then point it out. Things like, I held my questions to the end and I would appreciate it if you just let me get to the end also, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Let me just get through it. So we have an understanding for what a mutual behavioral expectation will be, and it is reciprocal at that point and respectful. And you'll ask them to take notes if they need to, and I would strongly, even if they say I don't need to, I might give them the pad anyway, because chances are as you're talking, something will come up, and whether they're writing down what you said or what they want to respond, fine, let them write it down, but that keeps them from interrupting. And if they do start to interrupt and say, yeah, but, you can stop, gently smile, and say, I do want to hear what you have to say. And if if there's an issue, great, let's talk about it. But again, please let me finish first. Just keep it very unemotional, not robotic, not militant, just, nope, let it roll off. As you feel their emotions rising up, you keep yours nice and easy. And then when you are giving your information, you want to use and encourage them to use a neutral and objective language. There's a big difference between saying, now that I understand what your major concerns are, I think it'll help when you realize that there's some information that I think your team may not be aware of yet. That's objective, as opposed to saying, you clearly don't know what you're talking about, which is what most of us want to say on that emotional level when we've heard some stuff coming at us, right? So that's more subjective, antagonistic, emotional language. Keep it neutral. There's some information that I don't think you possess yet that will help. Here we go. Then in the end, once you've had a chance to share, you can collaborate for solutions. But first, you want to make sure that after you have given them your side, you've asked them to feed it back to you, using neutral, objective reporting language. So now I'm done sharing my piece with you. What is it that you understand me to be saying? And ask them to feed it back. Because you'll recognize a variety of things, from maybe one, where you weren't particularly articulate and didn't do a good job of representing what you said. Two, could be where they weren't listening. They zoned out somewhere in the middle, or they missed a big point, or you just didn't say it well and you needed to re-explain it, or it was too complicated for them to understand. But you will understand what they've missed. And then once you've had a chance to clear all that up, then you can move to this and start working towards that collaboration. At which point, when you come to the result, and the answer may still have to be no. I can't give you the raise. No, we don't have the budget for this project. Try again next year. Who knows what the answer is? But at least when you're describing it, you want to try to explain why with that objective language, but then subjectively empathize with them. I understand that it's frustrating. I really do recognize how hard you've worked. I do understand that if we don't do this, there will be this repercussion as a result. This will suffer in quality or in time frame or in whatever else. Yes, I know it's going to cause trouble with the client. So now let's figure out what we can do about that. How can I help you get support to work with that, because I simply can't give you whatever it is, even though I want to. Because often in the end, even if they're not happy with the answer, the fact is most people just want to be respected and heard, first and foremost. So if you've gone through this process, they will at least feel like you have listened, you do truly understand what they need. They may not like that you can't give it to them, but it's not just about you being a jerk, or just because you're insensitive, or you don't care, or you're selfish, or you're whatever else it is. They get it and they get you. So you are both able to maintain the clarity of message and the nature of the relationship where possible. So you are able to attain that balance. So to wrap up, we need to stop asking things like, why does he always pick a fight with me? Or, why doesn't she ever respond to my email or voicemail? Because most likely, when we perceive someone in this light, what's really happening is that we haven't recognized their respective orientations to conflict and their tolerance for anxiety. Where the anxiety starts to kick in. Go back to that Grayscale. Where do they feel that fight or flight reflex kick in? And if it kicks in early, chances are the need is to flight, to have flight, to take flight. If it doesn't kick in till later in the scale, the fight is more likely where it's going to land. So that's important to recognize. So start with these questions first before you start to engage in the rest of the exploration of how to resolve the problem. And then ultimately, with that in mind, go to your 3 strategies for listening to understand, for those 3 stages. So with takeaway points and aha moments, I'm going to ask you. We'll wrap this up in a couple of minutes. We'll do Q&A. But as you're thinking about this, what has come to light for you?
So my question to you is, as I'm taking notes, was how do you get the feeling that this conversation is not going to repeat? You've gone through the whole process. How do you walk away with the understanding? If it was a no, that the understanding and why it was a no was understood and adopted, or the reasoning came through, or that they just said, that's what she always said.
Well, if you've gone through those 3 stages and really asked the person to feed back to you what they understand, and you've modeled that first, by doing your best to show them that you're really trying to understand what they say and you make sure that they feel understood, then that part should take care of itself. Whether or not they're going to be happy with you because you said no is a whole other ballgame. They may not like if you told them you can't have this by the certain deadline or we don't have the budget for that. That's beyond my pay grade. But as far as are they going to come back and fight me on it again, probably not, as long as they understand this point. Is there a guarantee of anything? No, of course not. But you're going to really mitigate that likelihood. Does that answer your question?
Sure. I think I'm just going to follow on what you just said. If you go through all those steps, do you ever say, especially if you still end up at a point of maybe different places, like you didn't get the raise, do you ever ask the question, how do you feel about today's conversation, or is that just too loaded?
I would be a little bit more specific.
Yeah, okay.
Right. So what is it about today's conversation that you want to know their feelings about? So how did you feel about the process of this discussion?
Right.
And if you were going to say that, if you're going to ask that, I would preface it by saying, I realize this is probably not the answer you were hoping for, and I really wish I could give you a different answer. But on a side note, though, I do want to make sure that you understand why it needs to be done this way, and that you feel like I understand where you're coming from, because that's important to me, that you feel heard, that you feel understood, that you feel respected. Do you feel like we've accomplished that through this discussion? Does that make sense? Then it's a little more focused as opposed to, well, I mean, yeah, you're a nice person, but I still didn't get what I wanted, so, go fly a kite.
Well, I think sometimes that closure, that reflection piece or whatever is really important, because especially if you end up in a different place, at least we understand each other better and we value each other.
Right. And if this is some person that you're interacting with on a regular basis, and you do this a couple of times, it becomes the culture of the organization of how to have difficult conversations. To begin by listening to understand. This becomes the expected balance. We know there's an issue, there's a conflict of interest of some sort, not a battle, but an incompatibility of perception, of perspectives. So how do we address this in a way where everybody feels safe, where everybody knows that their voice will be heard, that they will have a chance to say whatever they want to say, and that people are really going to try to hear them, regardless of position. And once they can expect the routine, expect the cycle, there's a comfort in that stability. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So any tips for adapting this to remote relationships, like on phone, on Skype?
Sure. So if you are working with a client, or you're working with a coworker, a collaborator of some sort, you're on Skype, you're on the telephone, there's really no difference for how you would approach it than if you were in person. To preface by saying, I know we've got some issues to discuss today that are a bit difficult, or we have to deal with budget or with whatever it is. I'd like to recommend, or I'd like to suggest that we try this new approach to discussing it today. Here's how I'd like to do it. First, I'd like you to share with me this. Then I want to make sure that I've understood it, and once I've understood it, and I'm going quickly through right now what you would say, but once we're done, then I'll share my side, and I'd like you to feed it back to me first, and we'll just make sure that we understand each other, and then we'll start to look for solutions. But I want to make sure that we get all the misunderstandings and the false assumptions out of the way first, because I think that's blocking us for the moment. Does that sound like something that you could facilitate? So whether you're on the phone, on Skype. The phone, I think, is the worst because you can't see someone, so there's a better chance than not that they're checking their email or doing their laundry or something else while you are talking and they're going, yeah, let me fix this. So when they can't see you, there's a better chance. It's harder. So at least if you say, you tell me and I will feed it back to you, then I will tell you and I'd like you to feed it back to me so we can get clear. Okay, there will be a quiz at the end of this of sorts. So pay attention, and I want to make sure that we are giving each other a mutual level of respect in the listening part. So does that help? Okay. Yeah.
Do you find that history, like I can envision me going from 0 to 60 or whatever on that scale, like different with different people?
Yeah.
And obviously, like some of it might be like a history with that individual, or
Of escalating right up to level 7 real fast, you mean,
yeah,
on the conflict?
I
Okay.
think I could find myself on a normal basis, like somewhere in the middle of that scale, but there are certain people that you have a history with that you might meet with.
Sure.
That I guess they just press your buttons or something where you can I can go like 1 to 9.
Yeah.
Like real fast.
Yep.
So I guess, how do you avoid bringing that history? I guess it's not, you can't avoid it, but how do you deal with it anyway?
Sometimes the best way to do it is not subtly, to really just reset. So when you hear, and part of it is a matter of being self-aware that if you know that this person pushes your buttons, when you're walking into that meeting, remind yourself, don't let him push your buttons. So how am I going to keep him from pushing my buttons? I know he's going to say something that's going to make my head want to explode. So before he even gets to that point, let's try this. We're going to sit down. I know we have this issue to discuss. And Bob, today I want to try something different. Here's what I want to try. And then explain to him those 3 steps. See what he says. Now, if he's totally closed off to it, even if you've explained why, the idea is to achieve this mutually acceptable outcome. And I think we can do it this way without engaging in any sort of argument. And let's just keep it a calm, rational discussion and move from there. Unless there's something pathologically wrong, I can't imagine him saying he wouldn't prefer that. So if he does, you give it a try. And it doesn't always work the first time. You can start that and then one person flies off the handle and loses control. It is a skill set to be developed. It does take practice. The listening to understand and the paraphrasing, the reporting language, to be able to feed that back to someone without interpretation or evaluation, and then you came up with this silly idea that this person wanted this and was going to do that, so I don't know where you got that, but apparently that's what you think. Is that right? Stay away from that kind of interpretation. Being able to objectively repeat back to them what they said and keep all emotion out of it is a skill that takes practice. So if you try this the first time and it doesn't have these magical Cinderella outcomes, don't assume it doesn't work. It's just like you can read a book on how to swim, doesn't mean that the first time you jump into a pool, you're going to make it down to the other end. Make it to the bottom possibly, but not to the far end. So it takes practice like anything else. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, David.
So your chart in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
continuum,
Mm-hmm.
preserve relationship, what was on the other end?
Clarity.
Clarity. So that's a good model to explain a lot of the discussions or confrontations that I had.
Mm-hmm.
But then I have others where they don't seem to be trying to preserve a relationship or achieve any degree of clarity. So is there some alternate way to, well, there seems to be an alternate universe. Is there an alternate way to think about these people?
I guess it would depend on what is the nature of what's the nature of the conflict. Can you give me an example? Without, this is not a therapy session, so if you can do a 30-second example of where the deviation is from where it doesn't seem like either one of these is an issue. Now, there are people, of course, who you can be in a conversation with them and maybe they're just going through a really bad day or a really bad year for that matter. So they're in a place where they're just not really able emotionally to have easy conversations about anything sometimes. So it may be a phase for them to get out of. But often if you are explicit and doing some what's referred to as metacognitive work, which is saying, I want to have a conversation, but I'd like the conversation to go like this. Step 1, step 2, step 3. They're so not used to that, that it's crazy enough that it might work. And I don't say that lightly, I mean semi-facetiously, but ultimately it's the idea that they've never had structure, they've never had someone say, I want to have a conversation to get to this purpose, and I think this mutually agreeable purpose, and I think the only way we can do that without tangenting and going off in this other direction where we tend to go, I'd like to try this. What do you say? And give it a shot, because sometimes you just need to really rattle the cage and reset. Because if they go on a default trajectory all the time, that reset can help. Give it a try. Okay. Any last comment? Yes?
Laura, I was just going to say that I think, to your point, I think these conversations are very interdependent.
Yes.
So to your point about going off the rails, I feel like when people have behaviors that are sort of woven in and they need to be reset,
yep.
That's what happens sometimes. So I think people are very taken aback when someone who goes from 1 to 10 very quickly says, okay, well, I'd like to hear exactly what you're proposing, and completely being quiet, not interrupting, and then regurgitating it back. It's almost off-centering. That person now has to defend and position what they want to say versus being used to the interruption, being used to being shut down, being used to having someone say that's ridiculous. And then they really don't have to prove it. So I think
right.
it really does change the dynamic if you start changing your behavior
yep.
and adapting to that person. That a person then eventually, hopefully, will adapt as well.
Right, absolutely. And you do have to lead by example.
Right.
That's the only option. You have to, that's why you invite them to talk first, and you model the behavior that then you will be able to refer to later and say, I did this for you. I would respectfully request that you do it for me now in return. Right. And so you keep it all objective that way. So with that, it's time to wrap up. For a free gift on the way out, for those of you who have signed up, and if you didn't sign up online, then to just jot me down your email address. I will send everybody a 10-point checklist on speaking like a leader, as the majority of my work is in leadership communication and executive presence. So a real easy checklist just to look down, whether it's on a phone call, in a meeting, or during a formal presentation of some sort. And the second one that I'll offer is a complimentary one-on-one private breakthrough session with me. We can do it live here in the city, or we can do it virtually through Skype or equivalent medium. But if you're looking for a 30 to 45 minute one-on-one with me to really identify what's going to help to persuade your audience to understand your views and get the results that you want out of any interaction, come and talk with me. We'll set that up. And with that, you can reach me on my website. I've got cards up here for anybody who'd like. Follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter, et cetera. And otherwise, thank you so much for joining me today.